So I promise the recap is going to start in under 2 minutes. I just wanted to very, very quickly explain how this video is going to go. So you will see that this video has chapters, and at the end of every season recap, I wanted to talk a bit about grief as we see it in that season. And that's because my name is Sabrina, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel I talk about psychology as we see it in various Netflix TV series and films. And what better show on Netflix to use to talk about the concept of grief than Stranger Things? But if that doesn't interest you, if you are just here for a true recap, feel free to skip those portions on the chapters below. So without any further ado, let's jump right in to the Upside Down. Okay, so all of Stranger Things is set in the 1980s, and it opens up at Hawkins' lab, where we see a scientist running for dear life, only to seemingly get scooped up and eaten by something. Then, after that, we see our four other characters here, a group of young boys playing Dungeons and Dragons. So we have Mike, we have Will, Lucas, and Dustin. After that, they just race home on their bikes. They're late to go home, so they race home on their bikes. Will cuts through Hawkins' lab, falls off after seeing some kind of figure in the road. That figure then chases him home, appears behind him, a bright light flashes, and now he's gone too. Then after this, we meet his mother Joyce and his brother Jonathan the next day. They find out that Will didn't seem to come home. They couldn't find him in his room. And when they call over to Mike's family, they find out that he didn't spend the night there, that he did leave there at some point. Then we go to the school and we get to meet Barb, Nancy's friend. Nancy is Mike's sister, and so we see Barb. And then after that, we get introduced to another character, Steve, while his tongue is down Nancy's throat in a high school bathroom. So, that's lovely. But then we meet Hopper at the police station, and Joyce is already there. She's coming to report her missing son, as any parent would. But of course, Hopper undervalues the seriousness of this, saying, "We are in small town Hawkins. What can happen that's bad in a small town?" Except for the fact that just about every serial killer, every prolific one, was from a small town. Now we go back to Hawkins' lab, and we see some kind of gross, moving, tree-like thing there, and some scientists in some white coats saying that she can't have gone far. Well, right away, we see after some girl in some kind of lab gown. She runs into a restaurant, and then when the guy catches her eating the food, the owner of the restaurant, and mistakes her for a boy at first, he decides to actually help her because then he sees that she's not a boy, she is a girl. And then we do see Eleven use her powers for the first time, and this person eventually does call social services. They come later that night to try to get Eleven, but wait! That wasn't social services. They off this nice man who was just trying to help for absolutely no reason, but thankfully Eleven escapes. And then we go back to Joyce, and they get a call. At first it seems like some kind of prank call, but later Joyce swears that she can hear breathing on the other end, and she feels like this is Will that she heard, and all of a sudden some kind of zap of electricity happens and the call goes out. And right after that, to end episode 1, we see the gang searching in the woods, hoping to find their friend. Instead, they find Eleven. They ask Eleven a flurry of questions, including if she has cancer and if she's deaf, which is giving me major Karen from Mean Girls vibes. Like, you can't just ask someone if they have cancer.
So if you're from Africa, why are you white? Oh my God, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
Eleven stays the night at Mike's house, unbeknownst to his parents, and now we see that the whole town is searching for Will. Everybody believes that he's missing now. We get our first snapshot of where Eleven came from with the flashback of her calling evil Ted Danson, who keeps lurking around her, Papa, as fully grown men then throw her into a room alone. Then not too long after that, when Lucas wants to make the rational decision of telling an adult that they found a lost little girl in the woods, the crew finds out for the first time that, well, Elle has powers. Elle sees a picture of Will earlier and seems to recognize him, then tries to explain to the crew that Will isn't missing per se, he's hiding, but not from a person, from the Demigorgon. Then Joyce gets another call of someone just breathing, but this time she actually hears Will's voice. Then she notices a strange flickering with the lights after the call ends,
and her son's cassette player randomly starting to play, and for some reason thinks, Will, is that you? While staring at a lamp? Now, in the midst of a child going missing, our lovely Steve Harrington does the respectable thing and throws a party. Nancy, of course, forces Barb to go, and while at the Harrington hoedown, Barb is trying to stop Nancy from getting deflowered on a Tuesday night from this mess of a high school boy, but Nancy gives her the boot, tells her to head out and basically kick rocks. Barb decides to stay for a little while, kick her feet around in the pool, and unfortunately, she gets the same treatment the scientist at the start of the show got. But then what we actually see is she isn't dead. At least, not right away. We see Barb struggling to climb out of the pool where she was snatched from, but it almost looks like a dark, distorted, twisted image of the pool. They keep flashing back to the present day where the pool's completely fine, full of water, and then this distorted version where she's trying to climb out and get away from this thing. Unfortunately, Barb doesn't make it out alive. Then we see Jonathan walk in on what effectively looks like his mom having a mental breakdown. She's surrounded herself with lamps and tries to explain the theory that Will is communicating with her through the lights. She says that she knows how crazy it sounds, but I don't know if she truly does. Hopper is then investigating a lead that brings him and his fellow deputies to Hawkins' lab, but gets a sneaky feeling that they're hiding something. So he and another deputy go to the library and they see some articles about the lab talking about alleged human experiments, lawsuits, etc., and think something really fishy is going on. Back at Joyce's house, she comes up with a brilliant idea to paint the alphabet on her wall to communicate with Will. She asks him where he is, and he says he's right there, which obviously is very confusing to her because he's not right there in the room with her. But then he also tells her to run, and we see something straight out of the movie Alien jump out of her wall. Then we flash back to Hopper and his team, and they get a tip and then head to a quarry, and we see them pull out a body that we can effectively presume has to be Will. That presumption seemingly confirmed when Jonathan and Joyce see his body at the coroner's office. They recognize it as Will, but Joyce still isn't buying it. With all that's happening in the town, Joyce isn't the only one losing her mind. Apparently Hopper has too, and seems to forget he's a police officer, and beats up one of the guys who found Will's body. And this guy shares vaguely that someone told him to call in the death and not to get too close to the body. Now, the gang sneaks Eleven into school to use the broadcasting system where she's able to channel Will, and we actually hear Will calling out for his mom. And then at the same time, we see that Joyce is also able to hear Will, but not only that, she can see him too, through the wall. Then we have Nancy. So when she was at the party with Steve and Barb and the others, Jonathan was hiding out in the bushes, taking pictures. The crew finds out, and they see the photos that he's printed, and Nancy eventually gets her hands on a few of them. She thinks she sees something in the picture that's taken with Barb by the pool, but can't make it out. And so then when Jonathan enhances the picture, they see a creature with no face. The same creature Nancy saw when she went back to Steve's house a day or so after the party looking for Barb. Now, if you thought Hopper couldn't get any more unhinged, oh boy. He breaks into where Will's body is being held, cuts into the body, and finds out that it's filled with some weird kind of stuffing. I mean, taxidermy as a concept is already strange to me, but this takes it to a whole new level. Somehow, from the little bit that Will said while on the radio, in terms of him being home, but it being dark and cold and empty, Mike is able to deduce that he's in this kind of upside down, an alternate reality. I'll let the gang explain what that means in a little more depth.
What if this is Hawkins and this is where Will is? The upside down.
Like the Veil of Shadows. The Veil of Shadows is a dimension that is a dark reflection or echo of our world. A plane without a face, places monsters. It is right next to you and you don't even see it.
The gang talks to their AV club slash science teacher, who gives them clues around a kind of gate that could open, and that being a way to get people to the upside down. Dustin, while they're all sitting together in a room, Dustin realizes that something is off with his compass and the other compasses. They're not facing true north. Then he remembers Mr. Clark, their teacher, says that a gate could throw off the Earth's magnetic field. And whatever that stronger field is, now that becomes the new true north. So they come up with a plan to follow the compasses north and find that gate. We get a flashback of 11 back when she was in the lab, hopping into what they call the bath. It seems to take her to this dark room where she's able to teleport, in a sense, and hear the conversation of this man speaking Russian. But present day, we see Lucas rightfully accuse Elle of screwing up their compasses. They realize that something isn't right, and he saw her using her powers on the track for some reason to keep them away from wherever this gate might be. Jonathan and Nancy then decide to go hunting for the faceless man creature. Then Nancy happens upon a tree oozing some liquid, seconds after seeing something grab and eat a deer in the woods, mind you, and decides to crawl in. She gets a very clear glimpse of the Demogorgon snacking on this deer, but lucky for her, she escapes out of what seems to be the Upside Down alive. So Hopper told Joyce about all the shady things he had seen and that had happened to him involving the Hopkins lab folks, including seeing a child's room and a badly done drawing in the room. Joyce tells him it can't have been Will because his drawings were incredible. Hopper then connects the dots and remembers someone telling him about seeing a kid with a shaved head that came through the restaurant that we know was 11. And then he remembers the newspaper articles that he saw in the library talking about a woman who says that Hawkins stole her child. He realizes he may have been looking for another kid all along. And we realize when Hopper and Joyce visit the mom whose daughter Jane was taken, this mom's sister seems to make connections to Jane, a child with special powers like telekinesis and telepathy, really being 11. And speaking of 11, she confesses that she's the one that opened the gate, and then evil Ted Danson and his team has the kids followed, and he reports that they are headed home. Lucas had split off from the crew and used his compass to get to Hawkins' lab. He realizes the gate is in there. He uses binoculars to spy on the lab and sees all these vans leaving and puts two and two together and discovered that the bad men were coming for Elle. The lab folks start to follow the gang, but fortunately, they get away. For now. Jonathan and Nancy hatched a plan to try and catch this Demogorgon, thinking that maybe it's attracted to blood in some way, since it preyed on that bleeding deer, and when Barbara cut herself and started bleeding, that's when it came for her. They stock up on an insane amount of gear to try and kill this thing when Jonathan's later detained for beating up Steve Harrington. Thank God, the kid definitely had it coming, and has all that stuff in his trunk. So now Hopper and Joyce find out that these two saw this thing, and now the four of them are kind of in this together. They have their own little crew. While at the station, one of the kids that has consistently been bullying Mike and his friends comes in and talks about a girl with a shaved head breaking his arm. And he also mentions that she can do things like make you fly. The kid shares that she always hangs around Mike and the crew, so now the four of the Hopper crew see Hawkins folks hanging out at Mike's house. The Hop crew decides to use the walkie-talkies to talk with the kids and find out where they are, and the kids explain to them what they know about the Upside Down and how to get there. 11 realizes that she can get there and find Will if she goes back into the bath, which we discover is basically a type of sensory deprivation tank. It works. She is able to find Barb, R.I.P., but she does also find Will, hidden in a treehouse fort that he made and called Castle Byers. This time, she finds him alive. Hopper and Joyce get caught by Brenner's crew while they're trying to find Will, but Hopper is able to strike a deal that lets them go into what we now know is a gate to the Upside Down in exchange for the location of where 11 is. Nancy and Jonathan leave and still try to go through with their plan to catch and kill this Demogorgon, but idiot Steve shows up to apologize to Jonathan and instead gets to learn for the first time himself what a Demogorgon is. Crazily enough, though, he actually stays to help, and they're able to get this thing in their trap and fry it alive thanks to him. The lab folks find the gang at school. Elle takes care of the first batch of them, and that's for the guy you shot in the head, lady. You deserve that one. But Brenner and the rest of his crew end up getting her. Their deaths were pretty bloody, though, and as we know, that attracts the Demogorgon. So while the soldiers are taking care of that, the kids use this chance to escape, but the Demogorgon catches up to them too. Elle uses the last of her strength in that moment to end it for good, and it looks like she evaporates with the Demogorgon. Joyce and Hopper find Will in the Upside Down with some kind of tentacle all the way down his throat. Really disgusting. But he wakes up. Will's fine. And so the kids, they go back to playing D&D, and then we see Hopper head into the woods and put some food, including Eggos, into a box. Although all seems to be well, it isn't. Will coughs up what looks like a baby piece of a Demogorgon, maybe, in the bathroom sink, and then has a flashback to being back in the Upside Down. Or was it a flashback after all?
Hello again, and I hope you enjoyed that season 1 recap. As a reminder, at the end of each season recap, I'm going to be talking about the concept of grief as we see it presented in that season. And so this one's going to be a little bit shorter. The one right after season 2 is definitely going to be the most in-depth, and I'm going to jump into some diagnosing. So definitely recommend watching that one if that's the only one of these that you're going to watch. And so I wanted to talk about really how to get through grief, and a big part of that in the process of mourning. Now, mourning is basically just expressing grief, sadness, sorrow, being able to kind of outwardly express it and therefore work through it. If we don't have a mourning process, then the grief itself continues. And that's because with our emotions and the things that we're feeling, they don't just dissipate into thin air. So imagine if you have a Coke bottle, like a plastic bottle. You shake it up a lot until it's fizzy, but you don't open the cap. It's not that the fizz inside of there that it just dissipates. I mean, if you leave it for a period of time, maybe it will, but the thing that we can know for certain with life is that life will continue to bring challenges. And so if you are experiencing mourning or grief like that shaken can, what's going to happen is, like we see in the show, is, for instance, Jonathan's just riding in the car and he hears "Should I stay or should I go?" that he remembers playing for Will for the first ever time. That's another time the bottle is shaken. Or Joyce just sitting at the kitchen table and just thinking about a time she had a random conversation with her son there. That's another time the bottle is shaken. So mourning is so key because it helps us to accept reality as it is. During COVID times, one of the jobs that I was doing was working at a college counseling center. And I remember working with this one college student that she was really struggling, as a lot of us were, through COVID because there was so much from her old life, our old life, that we were no longer able to do in the height of COVID. And I remember talking with her about, you know what, you need to mourn this. And it sounds funny because nobody died per se, at least not in her life, but need to mourn the fact that our life may never look the same as what it was before. That maybe you might never go to a concert again, or now life might involve putting on masks when you go places and standing away from certain people and being afraid whenever somebody coughs, right? And it's actually only after she really took the time to sit and mourn that like it was a death that she was able to feel a lot better. She was experiencing a lot of anxiety, depression, and being able to go through that mourning process helped so much. And so in terms of this season, we see a lack of mourning that's present with especially Joyce, but also Nancy. So Nancy loses Barb. We know that Barb passed, but Nancy doesn't necessarily know that. And then Joyce loses Will. He goes missing. Now, up until towards the end of the season, that's when we figure out that Barb is dead. But for majority of the season,
None of them know whether their loved ones are actually dead or if they're missing. Now, because they weren't accepting of reality, it did help them to be able to find their loved ones, but a lot of kids and even a lot of adults go missing every single day. Hundreds, thousands go missing all the time, and a lot of those folks are never found. So imagine if the gang in season 1, if they hadn't lucked out by searching in the woods in the dark in the pouring rain and finding 11 there, some random girl at some point in the woods, they probably would have never ever found out where Will was. And from what we see of Joyce, it's unlikely that she probably would have accepted the reality that he was gone. And so imagine what that would look like. She would never be able to move on because she wasn't accepting first the fact that he is actually gone. And so now what life looks like is kind of being stuck in time almost, that you're not able to actually move forward because you're always focused on the past. Like we see that she is focused on putting all those lamps around her and the lights and going to Hopper a bunch and talking about any issue that comes up. Like she's just solely focused on that one area. And so I don't want to pretend to know what it's like to lose a child. I mean, that must be one of the, if not the hardest things in the world, the hardest losses in the world to have to experience. But we can see Joyce's suffering throughout. And so imagine if this just continued for more than, I think it was even just over the course of a few days that this whole season took place. Like, imagine if this was weeks or months or a year and Joyce was exhibiting these same behaviors. She would completely just burn herself out. And then to talk a little further about mourning in general, kind of going back to the example that I gave about COVID, in IPT, which is interpersonal psychotherapy, a type of therapy that we can do where it focuses on 4 key areas in terms of problems that come about because of 4 key areas. So those 4 areas are grief being one of them, role transitions, role disputes, and interpersonal conflicts. And it's used for a bunch of different mental health disorders, so things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, even substance use disorders, PTSD, all of that. But I think what was so interesting is the role transitions piece. Because yes, they talk about grief and a loss, but they talk about the issues that can come when there isn't a loss present, but a major shift or major change can happen. And that change could even be, and a lot of times might be, something that we typically think of as positive. So we wouldn't necessarily think that we'd have to mourn the loss of something when we're stepping into something that seems positive. And so good examples of that could be becoming a parent, right? And especially if that's something that you want, there could be so many joys with that in becoming a parent, but there are losses of freedoms, right? Like there are changes that you have to make to your life. And so maybe mourning the freedom of just being able to just up and travel where you want without really thinking about it, without having to pack 50 million things to take with you on your trip, or being able to get a full night's sleep for like a year or maybe even a little bit more. There's a lot of different things to mourn there. Another thing could be retirement. I mean, I'm only 30 years old, but I already cannot wait for retirement. But if you're so used to working and having your day filled with work, just stopping and having nothing could be a huge shift. And a lot of times people might feel like they're not really being productive. They don't have things to offer anymore. It feels like a loss of purpose, that the retirement can be difficult. Other examples too could be even starting a new job, even if it's a more higher paying job, could be getting a divorce, could be a whole lot of things. And so just something to note about the concept of mourning, that it's really helpful with grief when we've lost somebody, but also helpful to move us through situations where there isn't an actual death, but there is a big shift. Okay, so I think I've yapped enough on that point, so we will jump right in to the season 2 recap, and you'll see me again at the end of that. Season 2 begins almost 1 year after Will disappeared, with a crew of criminals being chased by the police. One of them instructs the driver to make a turn down a road where there's a tunnel, and seems to use powers to make the tunnel collapse in front of the cops. The thing is, though, the tunnel didn't actually collapse. And as they're celebrating getting away, we see the woman who used their powers has the number 8 tattooed on her arm. Hopper's back, and we see a guy named Murray talking with him and trying to explain that there have been numerous reports of some little girl running around using her powers. There's hope that it could be 11. We see that we've got 2 new students at Hawkins. That is Billy and Maxine.
It's Max.
Sorry?
Nobody calls me Maxine. It's Max.
Joyce got herself a new flame as well. His name is Bob, which is the perfect name for a generic white man from Indiana. Will is still having these flashbacks or visions of the Upside Down, and he seems to have some kind of special doctor he sees about this that's connected to Hawkins' lab. And speaking of Hawkins' lab, we also figure out that the gate to the Upside Down there is still open, and it seems like some of the workers there are regularly burning parts of it so it stops growing. Now back to Hopper. We see him enter some cabin in the woods. He's stepping over tripwire. He's using a special knock to get in, so using a lot of precautions to make sure that whoever's in there is safe. And we find out that that's because 11 is there. And from the looks of it, she's been there a while, and no one knows but him. So in kind of a flashback, we learn that when 11 killed the Demogorgon, that it didn't kill her too. It brought her instead to the Upside Down, and she was able to find another gate to get out and go back into the real world. Now, the big part of this season is the gang going trick-or-treating, and Will has yet another vision of this shadowy figure that looks bigger and scarier than ever, and he realizes that it's coming for him. Now, 11 gets pretty tired of Hopper saying that she can leave the house soon and go see Mike and the others, but never gives her a sense of when soon actually is. So, she decides to go against the 3 rules that Hopper taught her and step outside for the first time in almost 1 year. Now, back at school, Dustin excitedly shows the gang his new pet dart. But when Will sees it, he flashes back to when he coughed up something that looked eerily similar to Dart. And speaking more of Will, Bob tells Joyce that he watched the footage back from the camera that he had lent Will for Halloween to do some of their filming, and in it he saw some kids bullying Will. And so Joyce takes the film, she watches it, and as she's watching, she notices that in the static of the video, she can see this shadowy figure. Now, a little bit earlier, Will had drawn this figure that his mom saw, and he lied to her about it. So now she knows this is connected to his visions and the Upside Down. Now, back at school, Will tells the crew that he thinks Dart came from the Upside Down. Bummer, though, that Dart, who's already grown since just a few hours before bringing him to school, escapes. Now, Elle, while Hopper isn't home, she runs into a mother and her daughter and asks for directions to the school. What she doesn't know is the mom reported seeing her to the police. So, Hopper knows that she left. Elle does end up finding the school, and she sees Mike with Max in the gym, so she gets upset and leaves before letting them know that she's there. Now, Will finds Dart in one of the bathroom stalls, and Dart ends up screeching at him, and as he does, it kind of sends him into the Upside Down, and that's where Will sees this shadow again, and it starts to chase him this time. But he remembers that at one point when Bob was driving him to school, he was telling him a story about having this fear of kind of similarly an imaginary person that he was afraid of, and so he decides to take Bob's advice, which was stand your ground, tell it to go away, and Bob did that, and for him, his bully went away. As we can expect, that didn't work with Will. Instead, the shadow starts to rapidly enter every orifice of his body. Now, Joyce tries to comfort Will and assure him that he's okay, and decides to draw him a warm bath because she takes his temperature and she sees that it was really, really cold. But Will ends up telling her that he doesn't want this bath because, quote unquote, he likes it cold, referring to this shadow creature. Now, obviously, this freaks Joyce out, so she invites Hopper over, and Will tries to explain what's going on to them. So because he's struggling so much, his mom suggests, maybe he draws it, and he gets to work. Now, Elle, she eventually did make it home. Her and Hopper had a huge blowout fight after he tries to ground her. And then he tells her to, clean the house. And as she's cleaning, she finds a latch in the floor leading to kind of like a mini storage dungeon almost in the house where there's a box labeled Hawkins Lab. Now back to Will, he's going on an insane drawing frenzy, which seems to not make any sense, the pictures that he's creating. But because Joyce honestly might be a little tapped, she realizes that the random scribbles, they do make sense. They connect. So she and Hopper take some time connecting them, and then Hopper realizes that she's drawing vines. Some local farmers in the area had been reporting to Hopper that there was these pumpkins that they had that were getting poisoned and they looked really rotted. So as soon as Hopper realizes they might be vines, he goes out to the pumpkin farm and starts to dig. He finds a whole tunnel system. Now going back to some other findings, 11 goes through the box that says Hawkins, sees a picture of who she thinks is her mother, so does her usual teleportation trick to find her, and she does find her, and her mother even calls out to her. She says, Jane. Now back to dumb Dustin. He sees that Dart broke out of his cage because, yes, he continued to keep Dart as a pet. He sees that he is broken out of the cage, and he finds him in the corner of his room, eating the family dog, and when Dart eventually turns around, he sees that he has the same face as the Demogorgons. With Will's freaky new connection to the shadow monster, he tells his mom that he saw Hopper, and he thinks he's going to die. Will draws the spot that he thinks he saw Hopper, and Bob the Brain, his words, not mine, figures out that Will drew a map of Hawkins, so they're actually able to pinpoint where exactly Hopper is. But before we get to that, they go back to 11 that goes to visit her mom and realizes that her mom has powers just like her. So 11 does her usual kind of teleportation thing in that dark room and looks into her mother's memories. Now she sees Brenner take her, Jane, right after she's born, and then she sees that her mother goes to find Jane and see where she is. She gets caught by the Hawkins crew, and they use electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, to turn her into this kind of non-responsive state that we see today, where she's just repeating the same words over and over again. And if you're interested in learning more about ECT and how it's done correctly, check out the video I made on it. Going back to Hopper now, Joyce and Bob, they get to the tunnel and go into it, and they do find Hopper alive, although barely. The Hawkins Labs folks, though, catch up with them, and then they start to burn these vines that have kind of gotten out of control to contain it like they usually do, except this time it starts to hurt Will badly. Now, dumb Dustin is finally, appropriately, afraid of Dart and hatches a plan, and it does work, to lock Dart in his cellar. He gets Steve to help him try and kill Dart, but instead they see that he's molted again. Now he's dug a tunnel into God knows where, so is loose in Hawkins. Later, going back to Will, he wakes up, but when he wakes up, he doesn't remember Bob. He doesn't even remember his doctor, and he doesn't remember Hopper, or even the fact that the night before he helped to save Hopper. He doesn't seem to remember a lot of things. Going over to Lucas now, Lucas tells Max everything, and of course, she doesn't believe him. Now, they eventually catch up to Dustin and Steve, and they try to set a trap for Dart, but what they didn't realize is that Dart wasn't the only one of these things out there. Lucky for them, they just randomly run off at some point and vanish. Well, they vanish to the same place that Hopper was actually found in just the day before. Will sets a trap for the Hawkins Lab folks by telling them to go there, only it wasn't really Will. It was this shadow monster using Will. And now after the baby Demogorgons have their dinner, they come through the gate at the lab. Now we're entering episode 7, which is just all about 11. So while 11 was in the loop in her mom's head, she kept seeing another girl and kept feeling like maybe her mom was telling her to go find this girl. So Elle uses her powers that she does to kind of track folks to find who she calls her sister. Now, number 8, or Callie, convinces 11 to join their crew of misfits and help them track down and kill the scientist from Hawkins' lab that had a part in hurting them and other children. Now, with 11, basically the human tracking device, they can easily find and kill these people. So 11 tries her hand at that, but she can't really seem to hack it. She finds that she can't kill the man who hurt her mother, and in using her powers to see that Hopper and Mike are in trouble, she decides to leave her sister and to go back to Hawkins. Now, getting back to the main story, the Demogorgons, they have taken over Hawkins' lab, and almost all the gang really skillfully makes it out, except Bob. Poor, sweet Bob. Since Will is now effectively a spy for what the gang calls the Mind Flayer, which is a monster from what seems to be the D&D world, the entire crew, they make it back together, and they hatch a plan to try to use Will to actually kill the Mind Flayer. But in order for this to work, Will can't know where they are, or he'll just signal to the other Demogorgons. As the crew is trying to remind Will of who they are, Hopper sees that Will looks like he's tapping and realizes it's Morse code. He's letting them know that he's still in there. And so they continue to distract the Mind Flayer by sharing a bunch of stories about old times, and Will is able to keep tapping in Morse code, and they're translating as he goes. So he eventually spells out a message telling them to close the gate. But when the house phone goes off, Will is able to communicate with the Demogorgons because he realizes where they are before the gang is able to actually get him to go to sleep. So as the crew is hiding in the house, waiting for the Demogorgons to get them, one of them just comes flying through the window. But it's dead. And guess who opens the door and strolls in right behind it? The team then realizes that they actually can't close the gate and kill the Mind Flayer without killing its host, Will. So what they plan to do is make the host uninhabitable. If it likes it cold, like Will said, let's burn it out of him. So Steve, being the good babysitter that he is, he tries to stop the kids from going out there to help, but Billy kind of ruins everything by showing up, beating Steve half to death, and then when Max grabs a syringe and knocks him out with, we don't even know what is in it, they steal Billy's keys and then they leave. Now the plan is simple. Go into the tunnel and find kind of the core, basically the heart, that all the tunnels feed into, and start to burn it to lure the Demodogs, lure them away from Hawkins' lab so 11 can close the gate. Meanwhile, we have Will being roasted like a Thanksgiving turkey, and after he has a decent glaze going, he's been roasting for some time, the Mind Flayer finally decides that he has had enough and leaves Will alone. Will's free. The gang's plan worked, and the Demodogs all leave Hawkins' lab, but 11, trying to close the gate, effectively draws all of them back to Hawkins. But thankfully, she's able to close it in time. And now all seems well. The Mind Flayer is gone, the Demodogs are gone, Hopper gets legal custody of Elle, the kids, they get to go to the snowball dance and just enjoy a good time. But as we know, this is Hawkins, so the gang isn't going to get off that easily.
Welcome back, everybody. We are going to jump right into the Season 2 grief topic, and that's going to be kind of a two-parter in terms of, in this season, they talked about Will having kind of PTSD about being flayed. He continues to have these like flashbacks and such, and so the doctor mentions PTSD, so I want to talk about that and if that's truly what he's experiencing. And then I kind of more generally want to talk about different diagnoses a person could experience when it comes to grief. And so right off the bat, what I want to say is what Will is suffering, and at least how they're depicting it, I do not think that he has PTSD. Now, I did an entire video on PTSD that was pretty comprehensive and in-depth, so I'm not going to go in-depth on this video on the symptoms and such. I encourage you to go and watch that
after this whole video if you would like. You'll still understand this part if you haven't yet. But from what we see, most of what Will is experiencing are these flashbacks, right? So a couple of the symptoms that I actually see are flashbacks, which we figure out they're not really flashbacks, but to the average person, if this wasn't like a sci-fi made up magical show, it would be flashbacks. When he's reminded of what the disturbing event is, the mind flare, he's having physiological arousal, it seems like some kind of trouble breathing, maybe a little bit sweating. We're not really seeing in depth, but it seems like some physiological arousal, probably heart beating, and then he's getting emotionally upset. So those are the main ones that I see. But from the full video I did on PTSD, if you all saw that, I talk with you about how this is one of the hardest diagnoses to actually get. There are a lot of specific symptoms a person needs, and so him just having 3 doesn't mean that he meets the criteria. I know you might be tempted to say, well, he's a child, like, shouldn't the threshold be a little bit lower for him? So maybe for him, he's experiencing this. And in terms of PTSD, you can have 2 levels, I guess, with diagnosis when it comes to age. So either 6 and older or 6 and younger. And so all that I said in that video that I did on it, all of the symptoms that we'd expect, that applies to him. So there's no difference, in a sense, in terms of how we would diagnose somebody his age versus an actual adult. And so, yes, at his age, that it is probably likely that he might be experiencing a higher frequency of flashbacks, and so that might make us think that it's PTSD. And I'll talk more in the season 3 recap of kind of how the teenage brain is different, especially in particular to grief, and how these things can be much more difficult for a teenager to process. But just because that's occurring, again, doesn't mean that he has PTSD. And people get this mixed up a lot. People feel like because you experienced a trauma and now that's kind of changed some part of maybe your present day life, that means that you have PTSD. You might be traumatized from what happened, but you might not meet a diagnosis. I mean, think about it. If I were to get into a really severe car accident, then it might be normal that from then on going forward, maybe I'm a little apprehensive when I'm in a car, or maybe I'm a little bit more on high alert than I was. And that's because our brain's job is to keep us alive. And that event nearly ended me, right? And so it wouldn't make sense really for our brain to not maybe be a little more apprehensive or careful in those situations. So that's very natural. That doesn't mean that now we have PTSD just because we are adapting to a situation to try to keep us alive. People really often mistake how resilient our brains are, that majority of us will experience trauma, 70% will experience some kind of traumatic event, but the vast majority will recover. Less than 10% of people globally receive a diagnosis of PTSD. And so I don't think he has that. I mean, we're not seeing symptoms like nightmares. He's not overly hypervigilant, so on guard. He's not really jumpy or startled. He doesn't seem to be having difficulty concentrating, like his grades aren't falling behind in school, or it's not like he's not playing D&D anymore. We don't really get a sense of if he's having trouble sleeping, but it doesn't really seem like he is. There's not really changes in his cognitions or his belief. Like, he's not really thinking, oh, the world's so incredibly dangerous, everybody's out to get me, I'm not safe, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's just a lot of things that aren't happening there that we need to see in order for him to have PTSD. So I think I've talked ad nauseum about that. That's probably not what's going on. So I'm going to shift to talking about diagnoses when it comes to grief. So there are a couple different ones that I will discuss, and the main ones are bereavement, adjustment disorder, and then the prolonged grief disorder. So let's start with bereavement. The first thing to note that this is not a mental disorder. It's almost like a way to say this is what this person is experiencing and kind of put them in a bracket. But there's certain diagnoses in the DSM, or certain codes, I guess, in the DSM, that you can't just put that on its own. Like, that won't suffice on its own as a diagnosis. So for instance, the population that I work with, vast majority of the folks are homeless. And so a lot of the times I will see like a diagnosis in their chart that says homelessness. Obviously, that's not a mental disorder, but it's just a way for when people look in the chart and quickly check over the notes and see that to understand that's something that they're suffering from at that moment. And so same thing with bereavement, that you can quickly look at it and say, okay, this person experienced some kind of profound grief and they're having, a tough time with it, of course, as we normally would. So bereavement is just normal grieving that happens. So with the normal bereavement, if you all have experienced grief, that you'll have the emotional symptoms. So of course, the sadness, maybe the anger, the guilt. You'll kind of have waves or pangs of maybe these things coming on. And then you'll have like a longing, a yearning, maybe for that person, crying, all of that. You'll likely also notice some cognitive symptoms. So difficulty believing that the person is gone. You just can't really grasp it, can't comprehend it. You might be preoccupied with the fact they're gone, so thinking about it a lot. Maybe you do have a little bit more difficulty in terms of attention, in terms of memory, some of your cognitive functions in that way. So all those are normal. And then you might have the behavioral symptoms. So those are things like the social withdrawal, maybe changes in your sleep or appetite, maybe going to the places that you shared with this person, etc. And it can be intense, your symptoms can fluctuate, but really with the normal bereavement, a person would gradually move towards acceptance of what happened. And yes, at points their functioning may dip, so maybe they might not do as well at work or do as well in social situations, but it won't be fully impaired. That's also important to note because that's a big part in terms of getting diagnosed with any mental health diagnosis in the DSM. You will see that there's a portion that says that it impacts your functioning in some way, that it's going to be hard maybe to go to work or go to social events, do the things that you have to do because of whatever disorder you might be suffering from. And so to note that bereavement shouldn't affect these areas at such a high level. And now, even if this does take weeks or months or even years, that still might not necessarily signify that it's moving to a disorder, especially if, like I said, this person is gradually moving towards acceptance. That's the key. And we do, just like all other diagnoses, have to take into account culture. Like certain cultures, it's more natural for people to grieve folks for longer periods of time. We can't just say, this person's been grieving for so long and it's so intense, it's been intense for a year, but maybe that's normal in their culture. Okay, so that's bereavement. Normal, not a diagnosis. Now we move on to adjustment disorder. This one is a diagnosis and it can have different specifiers, so different features. So a person can have adjustment disorder with depressed mood, so as it sounds, meaning that this person is experiencing depression symptoms. They can have adjustment disorder with anxious mood, or they can have mixed features, meaning that they could have a little bit of both. And you can signify if this adjustment is due to bereavement. So what does this mean? So this is an emotional behavioral response to some kind of stressor that is excessive, it is maladaptive, meaning that it's not helpful, and it is functionally impairing. It's getting in the way of doing the things that they need to do. Now, stressors that are common in this area, there can be a bunch, but ones that are common might be the loss of a job. It could be things like the death of a person, obviously, retirement, divorce. All these things are stressors that could trigger chronic adjustment disorder. Now, to receive this, you have to have these symptoms that develop within 3 months of the stressor. I mean, just think about the term, adjustment disorder, meaning you are having a hard time adjusting to whatever occurred. Like if we think about that term generally, so say if you take a new job, your friends ask, how is it? How are you doing? Or you move to a new place. How is it? How are you doing? I mean, if you say, which might be natural, you might say, I'm having a hard time adjusting. Typically, you wouldn't be saying that like at month 4, right? Typically by that point, we'd expect that you are adapting more as the time is going on, that you're adjusting more. You would likely say in the beginning, right? So in the first, whether it be days, weeks, or the first month, 2 months, that's when you really, really struggle. And then we'd expect from there that you are working towards adjusting to that thing. Now we understand that for people, you can have a hard time adjusting a little bit longer. So people can have a more chronic version of this, which can last up to 6 months. But if it continues after 6 months, then it is something else. You have to diagnose this person with something else. If they're experiencing adjustment disorder with depressed mood, then it would become depression. If it's adjustment disorder and it's based on a criterion A, and again, watch my trauma video to understand what that means, but basically not all traumas that a person experiences would count for a PTSD diagnosis. There are certain traumas that count, and so say if they experience like a natural disaster and now they're adjusting to kind of their life, maybe their city was destroyed or their home, and they're trying to adjust to life after that, and they can't after 6 months, then you would diagnose them, or maybe you'd move towards diagnosing them with PTSD. If they have anxious features, anxiety, so you would diagnose them with something else after 6 months. Okay, and so with some of the symptoms, it is not normal bereavement, right? Like you would just diagnose the person with bereavement. It is excessive. So they might have persistent depressed or anxious mood or hopelessness, really persistent and strong anger, guilt. They might be really acting out. Their sleep is constantly disturbed. They're having issues maybe functioning at work, school, all of these different areas. And for this one too, talking about culture, this would be beyond what is culturally appropriate. So even if it's a person's custom to mourn for like a year, maybe there's certain things in their culture in terms of how strong that mourning might be, what that looks like. So if a person is above that threshold, then they'd reach this criteria for diagnosis. And so that is the adjustment disorder that a person can get diagnosed with. And the very last one, which is a new one, is prolonged grief disorder. Now, this is new to the most recent version of the DSM, the manual that we use to diagnose mental health disorders. That came out in 2022. And so in it, that is when this diagnosis was introduced for the first time, formally put in. So what this is, or how to get diagnosed with it, is this is a prolonged grief response that is persistent, and it includes like an intense yearning for this person or an intense preoccupation with the person that was deceased. And this one lasts 12 months or more in adults, and then 6 months or more with children. So for a lot of these symptoms, I guess basically all these symptoms, you had to have experienced them for most of the days within a month. Now, if you just experienced them for a few, that would not characterize a diagnosis, because a lot of people can experience these things for a few, but again, it would be most of them. And so one of the two that you have to have is kind of just what I just said in the diagnosis. So there needs to be either a really, really intense yearning for this person or a really severe preoccupation with the fact that they died. You just can't stop thinking about it. Some of the other symptoms include somewhat of like an identity disturbance. So this thought of, man, part of me has died. Now who am I without this person? This person really defined a lot of myself. So now you have a disturbance in identity. There can be an avoidance of things that remind you of this person. So you're actively avoiding maybe going to places that you would eat together or have memories, or avoid going into their room if they lived in the house with you, or any number of things. A really, really marked disbelief. So a lot of times there might be some disbelief with the fact that a person is gone, but again, this is kind of past what we expect. And then this person also might have some difficulty reintegrating into life. So they just don't know really how to function anymore at work or school or amongst their friends. They're just lost, really. There could be emotional numbness. So a person might have one or the other in terms of really intense emotion, like intense bitterness or anger or sorrow, or might be completely emotionally numb to these things. They might have intense loneliness, and they might feel that life is just meaningless. So like other diagnoses in the DSM, this has to cause some kind of impairment in their social, occupational, emotional functioning. This person just kind of feels stuck in their grief, and the pain is always very intense and persistent for this long period of time. So this will be really interesting to see as we go further into the seasons, like season 4 with Max and her character, really digging into and really seeing how these symptoms present themselves with them. Okay, Hopefully that was interesting. I know it was a lot of information, but hopefully that was interesting and can help better understand some of the processes of grief. Now, without further ado, let us jump back in to Stranger Things and go into Season 3. Season 3 opens up in Russia, where we learn that idiocracy knows no cultural lines. We see some scientists use a machine to drill into a gate to the Upside Down. No surprise, Will is being weird again and is having some flashbacks of being mind flayed and keeps getting these chills on the back of his neck. Almost like he can sense the presence of this monster again. Steve Harrington is now working at Scoops Ahoy in the Starcourt Mall for the summer, and that's where he meets his coworker, Robin. Nancy and Jonathan are working at the Hawkins Post, and then we go over to Mike and Nancy's mom, who is hoping to have a fling with a high school boy, and gets all gussied up to cheat on her husband with Billy, who now is not only hot, but a hot lifeguard, so his charms are just too irresistible, I guess. As he's driving to their motel where they're going to meet up, an animal smashes into his windshield and he crashes. He gets out of the car, and at that point, something grabs him and takes him away while he's fighting for dear life. I still think Barb did it better, though. Unlike Barb, though, Billy did survive. And as he's getting away, he gets stopped by himself. Now, Billy is really going through it and experiencing an acid trip from hell. He is not right. And if that wasn't already obvious, he kidnaps his coworker and brings her, it seems to be a sacrifice to some gross thing. The thing is, 11 saw him. Elle and Max are besties now, and where they're hanging out, they decide to play a game of spin the bottle, except when it lands on your name, Elle uses her powers to spy on a person and see what they're doing. It lands on Billy, so Elle uses her powers to see him basically feeding that poor girl to a monster. Elle and Max end up going to Max's house, and they go through Billy's room and the bathroom while he's not there, and they find a lifeguard fanny pack. When they go back to the pool and ask the other lifeguards, they say that's Heather's. So Max and Elle hatch a plan to try and find Heather, which Elle does. But she finds her screaming for help. Elle is able to track down where Heather lives and finds Billy there, and to their surprise, also finds Heather there. As Elle and Max are leaving, Billy almost seems to have a flashback of 11 closing the gate and trapping the shadow monster inside. And then we see that Heather and Billy then attack Heather's family. And so for the first time, we see this new type of mind flayer, which isn't a shadow at all. And then we see it attach its tentacles to Heather's parents' faces and seem to put something in them, like how Will was found at the end of season 1 in the Upside Down. Will explains to Elle and Max that he thinks the mind flayer part that was in him may have never left when the gate closed. And if that's the case, it'll need to attach to a new host. The crew thinks that Billy may be that new host, so they hatch a plan to try to get him into the sauna at the pool to see if they can burn it out of him, like they did for Will. It works in the sense that they get him in the trap, but the flare doesn't get burned out of him. Instead, it activates. And 11 has to give it everything she has to keep this possessed Billy from hurting her friends. So catching you up on what Nancy and Jonathan have been up to. While at the Hawkins Post one night, Nancy receives a phone call, or the station rather receives a phone call, and Nancy answers it, and she hears some tip about these diseased rats. She eventually goes to the house of a woman named Miss Driscoll, who had given the tip. And she shows them that, actually, she caught one of these rats. When they do leave, though, we see this rat explode, and its mush start to kind of crawl away. Much later, Nancy drags Jonathan back to Miss Driscoll's house, and they go downstairs to see Miss Driscoll frantically eating this fertilizer. Now, their boss is pissed at her. What they don't know at this point is that their boss has been flayed, but he is absolutely pissed and tells them that she's a paranoid schizophrenic. And at one point, she sees Miss Driscoll screaming for dear life. It is absolutely terrifying. But that was the exact same point when Billy was also yelling. When she catches back up with the crew, that's when they're able to share stories, and they figured out that the Mind Flayer must be able to take over multiple people, including Heather, including Tom, Heather's dad, who's the boss at the Hawkins Post. The gang goes to Heather's parents' house and realize a scuffle must have ensued. They see blood, and then in the garage they see ropes. So they assume the parents were tied up and moved somewhere, so they're likely getting flayed in a different location. The issue is, right now they don't know where that location is, but Nancy remembers that Miss Driscoll, as she was being taken away, she kept saying, "I have to go back." And so they decide, well, why don't we let her? That Miss Driscoll can lead them to wherever this Flayer is. So they go back to the hospital, but by the time they get there, Driscoll's gone. They find Tom instead, and another one of their coworkers that has been flayed, and they're trying to chase and kill them. Nancy and Jonathan think that they get the last laugh on these a-holes and that they're gone for good, but instead they disintegrate into mush, similar to the rat, and they come together to form another creepy-looking monster. Elle and the rest of the gang catch up to Nancy and Jonathan and this monster, and Elle takes care of it. For now. Elle uses her powers to find Billy sitting alone in his room, and then goes into his mind, kind of like what she did with her mother. It works. Elle is able to find the location in Billy's mind, but then Billy finds her. He tells her that this whole time they've been building to kill her and her friends. And then, at the end of the episode, we see the flayed army march to their death, where they turn to this mush and come together to form an even larger flayed monster. The monster comes for the gang, and Elle is doing her best to hold it off, and with some help from the rest of her friends, she's able to do just that, and they can escape. Dustin is finally able to get in touch with Mike through the walkies, but he keeps cutting in and out. Eleven then uses her powers to find Dustin and sees him sitting at a movie theater in the mall. Now going over to Alexei and Hopper and Joyce, Alexei, well, he tells Murray, who Murray translates to Hopper and Joyce, that the Russians are trying to open a gate at the Starcourt Mall. Murray is able to find some schematics to the mall, and him and Hopper go on a mission to find and destroy this laser that is trying to open the gate. Billy finds the crew at the mall, unfortunately, and traps them there by taking the ignition cable out of the car so they're unable to get away. Now, Joyce and Hopper, on their side mission, they reach a kind of safe that they need to open to get the box that has kind of the switches in it that they need to close the gate. But the code Murray gave them to open it doesn't work. He thought he knew the code, which is based off of something called Planck's constant, but he got it wrong. Dustin knows just who can help, though. He calls his Susie Poo, and she eventually does give him the code, but not after they sing a pretty cute duet together. Joyce and Hopper go to close the gate, but that incessant Russian finds them again, but Hopper is able to finally get rid of him. Now, at this same time, Billy is trying to feed 11 to the Mind Flayer. Her friends are helping out by throwing some fireworks at it. And while it's going on, 11 has a heart-to-heart with Billy, basically, and reminds him of a memory that she saw when he was in his mind, the memory with his mom. Oh, and the whole reason she's having to do this, have this heart-to-heart, and sit and let her friends try to help with this monster is because at a certain point, 11 loses her powers. So this heart-to-heart, we see that it works well, and it is good enough for Billy to stand up to the Mind Flayer as he attempts to kill 11. And so Billy doing this does help to save her life, but unfortunately, it ends his. Joyce decides to close it with Hopper on the other side of the wall, meaning that when this thing explodes, that it is going to take him with it. And it looks like it does, but the Mind Flayer finally dies. Then after this, the show flashes forward about 3 months, where we see the Byers family is packing up their stuff to move, with 11 in tow, since now she is an orphan once again, and move on to their new life. We get a little bit of a teaser where we see some kind of Russian prison, and the guards are going to get a prisoner, and they throw him into the cage, and they unleash the Demogorgon. Welcome back, folks. Here we are for our season 3 topic, which is just generally going to be how the teenage brain reacts to grief and how that is very, very different than adults. I mean, why I wanted to do this on Stranger Things and what really stood out to me when I first watched Stranger Things is just how many teens, children, really just young people are experiencing loss, like numerous people in their life, close people, their friends, their siblings, even their parents, seeing them die in front of them most of the times and what that does to a child's brain. We're going to start with the brain structures, specifically 2 of them, which are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which are just essential to understanding grief in teenagers. And so the amygdala, if you don't know what that is, it mainly is kind of like responsible for managing, well, not managing, it's responsible for these intense emotions that we have. So when we experience things like fear, we're feeling it in the amygdala. So that emotional intensity. And the prefrontal cortex, it's responsible for kind of higher executive function. So it's responsible for planning, regulating our impulses, so inhibiting certain actions. It's responsible for things like actually regulating our emotions and decision making, a bunch of things like that. So in teenagers, generally, in terms of their brain structure, they naturally have a hypersensitive amygdala, meaning that it's kind of hyperactive. And that's because as a teenager, their amygdalas, they fire that part of the brain, it fires faster and stronger than adults. So teenagers do feel emotions more intensely than adults do. The problem with that is that they also have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. This doesn't fully develop until we're about in our mid-20s. And so, like I said, this is the part, one of the things that it does is helping to regulate our emotions. So they feel emotions stronger, but they don't have a way to regulate it as well. And when that comes to grief, this imbalance, it just intensifies. It only gets worse. So naturally, because of how their brains are set up, we see that teens are pretty moody, they have mood swings, etc. But this intensifies. They have big mood swings. So from sadness to anger to numbness, we see these big shifts in emotions. They also have more of an increased sensitivity to things that reminds them of the person that's deceased. And so if they, I don't know, stumble upon an article of clothing or listen to a song that reminds them of them, they are more stirred up by this, or they're not able to regulate as much the emotions that are coming up from it like an adult would. They really then have a heightened fear of loss and abandonment, especially because at this age, typically they might not have experienced a lot of loss, and depending on who they lose, this might be a point of reference that's really important or impactful to their survival. Like, say if they lose an adult, right, a parent, like this person's huge to their survival, and they're just not as used to the idea or used to seeing as many people in their life pass away. So they might have a heightened fear of this, and then they could have irritability that seems to come out of nowhere. Again, this typically will happen for teenagers, but all of these things that I mentioned are heightened because of grief. And then going to the prefrontal cortex part, the issue with that too, like I mentioned, this helps with regulating emotions, and so they will feel their emotions really strongly, but have trouble managing them. Like they won't really be able to, or will have a really difficult time calming themselves down when they're overwhelmed. They will also have more difficulty articulating their emotions, so you even know or have a sense of what's going on. They will often then engage in more risky and impulsive actions, and that's because, again, like I mentioned, the prefrontal cortex helps with regulating our impulses, and so that might be things like substance abuse, might be risky sexual behaviors, things like reckless driving, etc. And then they might have a heightened difficulty with organization, with focus. The prefrontal cortex helps a lot with this. And so then, because of a lot of these things, they might really struggle with school, because you really need all these complex functions to help with all the things that you do at school. So they likely will have increased issues there. So teens might appear that they're coping or just look very indifferent. I mean, the whole time I'm talking about these symptoms, I'm thinking so much of Max, especially after she loses Billy. So really coming up in the next season, as I talk about this, I think it'll be great to have it in your mind as you go into watching that recap. But they might seem that they're coping well or seem really indifferent, but internally, their regulation systems are overloaded. And then speaking of different systems, the last kind of brain thing that I'll talk about is the reward system. So the dopamine pathway. This is naturally more hyperactive in teens as well, and then grief disrupts this even more. So because of this, teens who've experienced grief might seek to escape or seek to really numb or cope with what's going on through a lot of different pleasure-seeking behaviors, and not necessarily safe behaviors like I mentioned before. They might often swing to a kind of social withdrawal or isolation, to a huge peer dependence where they're really overly dependent, like codependent on some of their peers. Then they might escalate in terms of their experimentation with substance use, just a lot of different things that get that dopamine system activated. And so, likely because of this, it looks like a teen that's experienced grief is acting out, but really they're trying to stabilize their dopamine pathways, their dopamine reward systems that have been thrown off because of the loss. So I think this is a nice point of empathy with teenagers too. Hopefully a lot of what I'm saying already is leading to feel very empathetic towards teenagers. There's a lot going on with them, not just mentally, but actually, mentally in a different way in their brain. Some other things to consider is that for teenagers, they're in the middle of really trying to figure out their identity, get their own sense of autonomy, and figure out kind of their worldview. Like, this is a huge period of time for identity development. And so when grief comes in, it can really disrupt a bunch of things related to this. So for instance, their self-concept, this idea of who they are. When they lose somebody that's super important, it could kind of bring in the sense of, well, who am I without this person? Or especially if maybe if it was a sibling or a parent that's kind of always been in their life and all their life events are experienced with that person. It's like, well, who am I now apart from them, now that they are not in my life? It can also really impact their future planning. So almost like an apathy of, well, what's the point? Like, what's the point of planning for the future? Because grief, or somebody might just die. For instance, I might just die. What's the point? Or what's the point? Because the person I love so much, like say if it's a parent, they won't be there if I graduate from college or if I get married. So like, what's the point of any of this? Another thing it disrupts is this kind of sense of invincibility. Now, all teenagers, we experience this. This is natural, part of our brain and development. Naturally, that does go away over time. That's the hope, if we allow it to. That does go away over time. And that's a good thing, right? Like, if we just walk around with feeling like we're invincible, we'll do very dangerous things. But if that is disrupted too early, that can be a bad thing too, because that can swing a person all the way on the other side of just constant anxiety of, oh my gosh, I'm not invincible. I could die at any point. Like, bad things can happen at any point, and then they're just worried all the time. And so, yes, it's good to move past this feeling of invincibility, but not too early. And then the last, in terms of worldview, this really impacts probably how they view the world in terms of just the fairness of it, and just also the stability of things. They might have this kind of sense of everything being shaky or rocky, that nothing lasts because of this loss. Now, two more factors to consider specifically for teens, and then after that I will talk about what to do, so things that can help teenagers who have experienced grief to kind of move through and heal a little bit better. And so the next piece is the cognitive piece. So teenagers, cognitively, their understanding of death is basically adult-like, but the emotions are not, as I've already talked about. So for teens, as opposed to true children, they understand that death is permanent. There's no coming back from it. They understand that it's universal. It happens to everybody. Everybody goes through it, and then they understand that it can happen anytime. So they have this knowledge, but don't have as much of a way to really process that knowledge, like process it emotionally. So it's a difference between knowing something in your head and then knowing it in your heart. And then they'll often kind of intellectualize the loss because that is stronger than the emotional processing, right? So they'll intellectualize it, but they'll really struggle to process it, which that can also lead to it looking like they're coping better because they're able to maybe talk through it and it doesn't seem like they're overtly expressing certain emotions for some teens, but it doesn't mean that they are. Hopefully that makes sense. And the last factor I wanted to talk about is the social nature. As we know, that for teens being accepted, they are hardwired to really kind of crave this strong acceptance from their peers and to really move away from reliance on parents and kind of looking at parents as their reference and, their kind of North Star. They kind of look more at their peers for that. And then there's also really this strong need of belonging. So what can happen is when it comes to grief, that peers might not know how to support them. I mean, it's unfortunately common, but still, there might be a lot of teenagers who have not experienced a loss, and depending on the type, have not experienced that specific type of loss, so don't know how to support maybe their peer that has experienced it. And so what that can lead to is that person, that teen who's experienced it, feeling incredibly lonely, feeling like, well, no one understands me. And to go into that, because they really are kind of wired to be accepted or to crave that belonging, what they might do if they realize, hey, nobody understands me, then they might try to hide their grief to fit in. And so it might look like them more so pretending when they're at school that everything is okay when they're not, which can just lead to more loneliness. And that also can push them too towards that like pressure of feeling like they need to move on, just be done with this, right? Like earlier than they actually maybe should be in their process. And so even if it really, really still hurts them and is a huge weight, they might feel like, I gotta move on from this. I can't stop talking. I gotta stop talking about it, right? So I can be accepted. So I said a lot. And again, I hope in hearing this, I mean, as I was doing some of my own research for this too, because I'm not a child person, so I work with adults, not really teens or children, so brushing up on some of this for myself, it really just pricked my heart in terms of how difficult it is for these teens, especially when they experience a loss. So what can be done? There are some things that can be done to kind of help them to process and move through a little bit better. And the things that I'm going to mention are helpful because they help with regulating more of that amygdala system. And so some of these things are, I know I said they move away from more reliance on parents and things like that, but still having one really strong, stable, emotionally available adult in their life can be super, super, super important. So giving them that stable person. Also in terms of stability, predictable routines and schedules. Like I said, in terms of their worldview, they might already feel like things are not stable. Crazy things, really bad things can happen at any time. So that just really can disorient them. And so giving them a good stability in terms of day to day. Then also allowing them the permission to talk or not talk about the loss. So sometimes you might kind of pressure teens to say, you got to talk about it, you got to get it out. And even in the next season, we kind of see that with the counselor with Max, but not pressuring them to do that. Like I said, they have more difficulty too, a lot of times, articulating how they're feeling and processing it. So this can just be like added pressure to them when they feel like, I actually don't know how to do that, and you're trying to force me to do that. And so it can be a lot. So not pressuring them to, and also not stopping them from talking about it. Sometimes it can feel like, oh gosh, I don't know if they've moved on well, if they're adjusting well, if they're talking about the loss a lot. It can feel like, is this re-traumatizing them? But not being scared of how they might process it, which is talking about it. And then another point, I just talked about the social aspect. So then having a good supportive group of peers, so supportive peer relationships, super, super important. And then access to safe coping outlets, so not risky ones, safe ones, things like sports or art or music or dancing or whatever it might be, ways to kind of express and process how they're feeling, especially when they might struggle in doing that with their words. And then lastly, avoid this over adultification. Like I said, because of a lot of the different factors going on, it might seem like the teen is coping a lot better than they are. So to avoid really pushing them through and treating them as an adult when it comes to the grief. Especially, like I said, cognitively, they have that more adult understanding, but emotionally they don't. So not overburdening them with responsibilities and things like that when it comes to this. Now, hopefully that was beneficial to understand the teen brains a little bit more and likely what a lot of the folks in Stranger Things are going through. Thankfully, they do have supportive, stable adults in their life. They do have supportive peers who can understand what they're going through, which is likely how they seem to adapt so well to a lot of this loss. But like I said, I think you'll see a lot of what I just mentioned, a lot of the traits pretty evident in Max coming up. That's where I noticed a lot of this. But yeah, I will stop the chitter chatter and jump into our final season recap. The final season opens in 1979 with Dr. Brenner and the child subjects that he would regularly test on. He's doing a testing with number 10. He sees that another one of the child subjects has killed almost everyone. The other doctors, staff, and even the other kids. Brenner eventually finds the only remaining survivor, a child, 11. Getting back to present day, on Max's way into what seems like mandatory grief counseling, she notices Chrissy coming out looking upset, and then sees her again in the bathroom throwing up. Chrissy is then seeming to have a worse version of Billy's acid trip from hell from the previous season, and having these horrible hallucinations. Then we get introduced to Eddie, the leader of the Hellfire Club, which is just the club name for Dungeons and Dragons. 11 is just being bullied left and right. She can't take it anymore and tries to use her powers on one of her bullies, but we see that her powers still haven't come back yet. Staying in California, let's catch up with Joyce. She got a package mailed from Russia with a doll in it. She tells Murray, who then tells her to break the doll and inside find a letter that says Hopper's alive and where to find him. Back to Chrissy, she now asks our dear Eddie to buy some drugs. But while in his apartment, she sees some kind of creature coming for her. But all Eddie can see is what looks like Chrissy in a sort of trance. He tries to wake her up, but can't. And then he sees her die in one of the most horrific ways that I could imagine. We get a flashback of when Joyce turned the levers to destroy the machine, opening the gate to the Upside Down. Hopper did make it out alive, but as he was trying to escape, the Russian kidnaps him too. Going back to Max, apparently Max lives next door to Eddie, and she explains to Dustin that she saw Chrissy's body in Eddie's apartment that morning, and the night before, she saw Chrissy go into his apartment. And then Eddie, at one point, run off, looking super scared shortly after. The next day, the police interrogate Chrissy's boyfriend and ask questions in a way that seems to imply that Eddie killed Chrissy. Nancy decides to take one of the yearbook editors, Fred, with her to go to Max's house, Max's neighborhood, and investigate the murder. But while there, Fred starts to hallucinate. He sees bugs crawling on this officer and accusing him of being a murderer. They get into the compound, and Nancy finds Eddie's uncle and talks with him about, well, he talks with her about a guy named Victor Creel. He got put there for offing his family and taking their eyes. Victor is likely to blame for this crime because Chrissy's eyes were gone. Now, while they were talking, Fred ventures off into the woods, then has his own freaky visions as well, until the same creature that offed Chrissy does the same to him. Murray comes to Joyce and reads the ransom that she found and explains that her and Hopper are the only ones that knew about their date at Enzo's. Murray tries to talk some sense into her, but as we know, over 4 seasons now, there's no doing that. Joyce and Murray call Enzo and record it. Enzo makes a comment that Hopper is stuck. They hear a Russian woman talking in the background, and she uses a word that means guard, so they realize that Hopper must be in prison. Now going back to Eddie explains what happened to Chrissy, and then they in turn explain the Upside Down to him. They realize that Chrissy may have been under a curse, Vecna's curse. The Hawkins basketball bros go on a mission to find Eddie, and Lucas is so desperate to fit in that he helps them do it. Long story short, with Elle, she's being taken to juvie for hitting one of her bullies in the face with a rollerblade. But in the process of being taken there, she's intercepted by the Hawkins lab crew, including Will's old doctor. But he's not there to hurt 11. He knows how Elle can get her powers back. Now remember Victor Creel? When Robin and Nancy go to the library, they find an article on him from the 50s stating that his house was haunted and an ancient demon killed his family. Now Max ends up going to her counselor's home and stealing her keys, breaks into her office at school with the other guys, and goes through Chrissy and Fred's files. She realizes that she's been having the same symptoms as them. She's next. Max gets her first vision of the clock and explains to the crew that she had the same symptoms as Chrissy and Fred. Both of them died 24 hours after having their first vision. Max is on the clock. Nancy and Robin go to find him, and he tells them his backstory of moving into a home and realizing there was an evil there. That him and his family started having these visions and nightmares, and then they eventually suffered the fate that all do when they are cursed by Vecna. Meanwhile, Hopper somehow escaped the clutches of these Russian guards, but not for long. The pilot who Enzo paid to take Joyce and Murray to Hopper decides to turn on all of them. Instead, to make so much more money than what Enzo had promised him that he'd make. Back to Max. She has some of the guys take her to the cemetery where Billy was buried and reads a letter that she had written to him. And at least Vecna gives her the courtesy of finishing before she goes into a trance-like state. Now we flash back to Nancy and Robin, who remember that during Victor's story, he made mention of music playing. And as he was thinking back to the memory while in prison, he started to hum. They start to think that maybe music is a lifeline back to the real world. Thankfully, those two escape in time to tell the crew this theory. So, they find Max's favorite song, and they start to play it that we all know and love so well, which does open up a small portal back into her world while she's in this trance. She manages just barely to get out of Vecna's grasp, and despite all odds, manages to run up that hill back to her friends. Max spends some time sketching out her adventures in Vecna World, and just like they somehow did with Will's drawings in Season 1, Nancy's able to connect the dots and realize that Max was drawing Victor Creel's house. Now Owen, who was Will's doctor, is officially on my shit list now for bringing her to evil Ted Danson, who actually didn't get eaten by the Demogorgon like we thought. So they put her to sleep and then somehow back into the same lab, same experiments as when she was a kid. Except this time, it seems like she's living in a never-ending loop. But then Brenner lets her know that she's actually trapped in a memory. While 11 is doing that, the Hawkins basketball crew find Eddie, but as they're chasing him, see one of their own succumb to Vecna's curse. Again, in a pretty brutal way. Now, 11 isn't hacking it inside the sensory deprivation tank, so they wake her up. When she tries to escape and the guards catch her, she's able to use her powers. But she doesn't have her powers back for good. And so she can get them back for good only if she stays with Brenner, and she decides to do that. After hearing about the death of Basketball Boy, Lucas remembers that he had come to school once with the black eye, and starts to put it together that Vecna is targeting people who have someone in their life hurting them, or haunting them. Now the crew does end up finding Eddie, and on the way there, Dustin realizes that there's an issue with his compasses. Remember what caused this in Season 1? That's right, the presence of an electromagnetic field. That can be caused by a gate to the Upside Down. So they follow these compasses, which leads them to Lover's Lane. Steve jumps in the water and finds it at the bottom of the lake. And as he's escaping back to tell the others that it's there, a tentacle pulls him in. Now we have demon bats to worry about. And back in California, we have Will, Mike, and Jonathan that end up finding Susie, who helps them figure out where 11 is located. Thankfully, None of the crew in the boat were smart and jumped into the Upside Down after Steve and helped to save his life. But why did a gate open up at Lover's Lake in the first place, though? Well, Dustin realizes that whenever Vecna ends a victim, he's creating some kind of connection with them. He's opening more gates. The Upside Down crew make it to Nancy's house to try to find some weapons that she has there, and they see some kind of sparkling aura around the lights, and they use it to send an SOS that Dustin and the gang can see. More on that in a little. Let's jump back to Hopper. Hopper and the other prisoners get thrown into a ring with a Demogorgon. In the meantime, Joyce and Murray have found a way into the prison by Murray imitating Yuri and taking Joyce, and who's supposed to be himself, in as prisoners. Joyce and Murray help Enzo and Hopper get free, and they have a very emotional reconnection. Now getting back to Hawkins, the crew, they use a type of Etch-a-Sketch to communicate with the folks in the Upside Down. And Dustin lets them know that there's a gate at every murder site. So they head for one. Both of them meet up at the gate by where Chrissy died, so in Eddie's apartment. Robin and Eddie, they make their way out, but when Nancy tries, she ends up falling into the same pool Barb did. We see that she's in a trance by Vecna. Let's catch up with 11, which will reconnect with this. In her memory, she connects with an orderly who lets her know of a plot from the other child subjects to off her. We see him getting punished for, it seems like, helping her, so 11 has built a strong bond with him. They start to escape together, and L pulls out what seems like a tracker from his neck. We see that he himself has powers. That's because he's number one. 11 walks in on one, offing two, and at the same time we see Nancy get to Victor Creel's house in this Vecna's vision. Number one gives this lengthy monologue in which we realize Vecna wasn't another person cursing the Creel family. It was the son all along. He eventually offed his own family, but he was only a boy, so he was too weak when it came to ending his father. And then after waking up from the coma that this put him in, he was put under the care of Brenner, who, not being able to control one's powers, reproduced them. At the end of this speech, one asks 11 to join her on his journey, and she says no. An epic battle ensues where it seems like one is getting the upper hand until L fights back, and she sends him into the Upside Down, creating a gate, which is what we saw when this season first opened up. When he's in the Upside Down, a bunch of lightning bolts, they strike him, flaying his skin, and they turn him into Vecna. Going back to present day with Vecna, he doesn't give Nancy the usual treatment that he gives his victims. Instead, he shows her a vision of the world being destroyed and tells her to tell 11 everything she saw. But on the bright side, 11 got her powers back, so maybe the world stands a chance. Brenner is finally honest with Elle, and we see that he saw a video of Elle way back when destroying Henry/1/Vecna that day. Brenner realized that he was still out there. Nancy tells the crew about her visions and that she specifically saw 4 gates. Then Max realizes that Vecna's clock always chimes 4 times. So likely it'll only take 4 kills before Hawkins falls. And Vecna's on kill number 3. Max decides to use herself as bait for Vecna, while the crew go into the Upside Down and kill him. How, you might ask? Well, whenever 11 teleports, she goes into this trance-like state, right? Her natural body, if somebody were to sneak up on her, she wouldn't even know they were there. So it's likely that Vecna does the same too. So they'll get him while he's trying to get Max. Now, a couple of military men find Elle and Brenner because they think Elle is the one causing all the deaths at Hawkins, which honestly, fair, because saying the boogeyman did it isn't realistic. So they tried to kill Elle, but she gets them in the end, and Mike and Will and the others find Elle alive, and Brenner dies. For real this time. Eleven realizes that she can use her powers to go into Max's mind and keep her safe from Vecna. They don't have to go all the way to Hawkins. Dustin and Eddie were in charge of distracting the bats from Vecna's lair, which they do, but they didn't expect the bats to get in, so Eddie buys more time. While that's happening, thankfully, Eleven makes it to Max just as Vecna is about to get her. Oh, and he's about to get her because Nancy, Robin, and Steve were the ones that were supposed to kill Vecna while he was in his trance, but they're otherwise indisposed. Vecna ties up Elle so she can watch as Max dies, but Mike makes a rousing speech to break Elle out of Vecna's hold, but it seems like it happens too late. Vecna's curse has started, but Eleven seems to be able to keep it from finishing. Hopper, Joyce, and Murray realize that back at the prison, there's remnants of the Upside Down that maybe they can use to their advantage to help the kids. They go, trap the Demogorgons, because there are multiple now, in a cage, then Murray burns them alive. That kills the bats attacking and gets rid of the vines choking Steve, Nancy, and Robin, so then those three can flambe Vecna as planned. I'll save you from rewatching probably the saddest death in Stranger Things, as Eddie dies in Dustin's arms, and then right after that we see Max die in Lucas's arms too. To confirm that, the grandfather clock chimes 4 times. 4 deaths. And then we see something ripping open all of the Upside Down and all of Hawkins. Will, Mike, and that whole crew have no idea, though, until they finally get back to Hawkins. But while she was still in Max's mind, we see Eleven place her hand on Max's chest, and we don't know exactly what she does, but it brought Max back to life. Well, into a coma. But obviously, it can't end there. Will tells Mike that he can still feel Vecna. He knows that he's alive. And evil is coming. Hawkins is falling. Woo! Made it through all the recaps, and now it is time for the final grief topic. And from season 4, I wanted to discuss specifically Max's letter that she writes to Billy after he died, and that she goes to the cemetery and reads to him. In general, I wanted to talk about how writing a letter is such a great way to process grief and how it helps in distinct ways in terms of our brain structures and just how it's better a lot of the time than even verbally processing. And not just my own opinion, but it is one of the most evidence-backed, evidence-supported methods in terms of managing grief across different therapy modalities. So across like IPT or CBT, EMDR, a bunch of grief or meaning-centered grief therapies, etc. They often will talk about writing a letter, and so I'm going to discuss the reasons why it is so beneficial to write to deceased loved ones. So let's talk about that. So the first thing that writing a letter helps with is that it helps to make the internal external. Grief can be so overwhelming because there's so many thoughts and things swirling around without any kind of structure. And so it helps to take that internal chaos and bring it out externally. And a lot of the reason why we might ruminate on things is because, especially if it's something important, like a loss, and needing to process that is really important for us to move on, or if it's things that we're really anxious about, worried about, that we need to do, our brain will often play those things over and over and over again in an effort to simply not forget them. Writing it down simply helps with, a lot of the time, that thought getting out of our mind and being put onto the paper. That way we can't forget. We can just look at it on the paper. So that helps in just a basic sense because of that. And I really encourage people as they're writing to picture like the thought in their head, picture it going from your brain, traveling all the way down, going into your arm, and then going into the pen as you write on paper, right? You're like copying and pasting these thoughts onto the page. So it helps to do that. And then it helps to create like a psychological distance between these thoughts, between the rumination, because now the thoughts are not in your head. They're now on the paper, and you could literally, physically walk away from the thoughts now if you'd like, versus the overwhelming thoughts being in your head and following you around. And then it also makes the thoughts too more observable, like you can literally look at them and read them. It makes them more nameable, and therefore helps to often make them more manageable. So writing in a general sense is really great because this activates the prefrontal cortex. And as I talked about in the last recap, the prefrontal cortex, one of the things that it does is regulates our emotions. And for teenagers, they have a huge imbalance to where their prefrontal cortex is not developed. Their amygdala, which is the emotional intensity part, is highly hyperactive. And so this could help to kind of create more of that balance. And then it also helps us to just see the death and be able to accept it as more real and more final. So for people that are really feeling stuck in the grief and can't seem to get over that stuckness, this can be incredibly helpful. And if you remember from the season 2 recap that I mentioned, that stuckness in the grief can be indicative or could potentially lead to a diagnosis. And so doing something like writing is then incredibly helpful in that way. Another thing writing does is it helps with strengthening kind of the meaning making networks, that it can really help us to just understand more of what occurred, to really like process the significance of that relationship to us, and to be able to articulate your gratitude, your hopes, your unfinished business, your regrets. Max does this really, really well in her letter to Billy, where one of the hopes that she shared is, man, I hoped that at one point in future we could end up becoming like really good friends, like best friends. And she mentions, yeah, I think it's, kind of silly because we fought a lot and kind of hated each other, but able to articulate a hope that she had. And doing all these things really helps to understand what the loss means then for that person's future. So maybe for Billy, or for Max, sorry, I feel like I keep calling Max Billy. Maybe for Max, helping to understand that, okay, Billy is not going to be in my life anymore, and what does that mean, right? Like now there's not going to be another person, at least around my age, that understands my experiences and maybe understands me in a profound way. And so it can help to figure out the future too. So by writing, it just naturally helps to activate that portion of our brain that aids us in self-reflection. So the fourth thing that writing does is it helps us to just naturally almost like break the bond of attachment with this person. It's kind of a safe and symbolic way of continuing this relationship. So, I mean, think about it. When you lose a person, especially if it was a person like really, really close to you, that is very abrupt. So now you have to just accept, okay, they're physically absent, and now they're also this just personal relationship that I have with this person is absent. And that can be a lot to do with all at once. So writing a letter can still keep that internalized connection portion alive. So yes, the person is dealing with now their physical absence, but as they're writing the letter, and then as Max does, as she's reading it out too in like a conversation, kind of like a simulated conversation, this helps with still feeling connected. So almost like that person is now internally here versus being with them physically, which when we think about grief, that's where we want to move to anyway. Like we have to accept and know that that person's no longer physically here, but they can be with me internally. So the letter helps with that process to where it's not just so abrupt and just, okay, now you have nothing and you have to accept that you have nothing with this person. Now I know I mentioned that it does help to regulate our emotions, but I forgot to mention at that point that there are some brain imaging scans that had been done that showed that after a person had gone through this kind of expressive writing when it comes to grief, that the amygdala in the brain was less active, that they saw less activation after that. So we see that the research does show that it significantly helps with managing that amygdala, which again is going to be significantly helpful with teens. So it can really help to calm them when there's all this emotional flooding. It can help to reduce their rumination. It can help to channel this like raw emotion into a more structured expression of it. Just really helps in those ways. Can't overstate it enough. And then to speak more on emotions, like I mentioned in my last recap, that especially for teens, it might be difficult to actually express and to articulate what emotions that they're feeling. And so this can help to do that. It can help to access those emotions, and it can help in a way that's really more honest, that there can be more kind of messy truths involved, that this person has the ability to express more of that anger or that guilt or even relief, depending on the relationship they have with this person. They can just be more vulnerable You don't have to worry about a fear of judgment versus like when you're saying something out loud, even if it's to a counselor, it's another person. So it's natural to kind of worry about how it might sound. Like if you say, I remember when Jeanette McCurdy came out with her book. I hope that's her name. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. Maybe it's a different person. I don't know. When she came out with that book of I'm glad that my mother died and just how horrible she was to her, like she did eventually publish it and everything, but she wrote that, right? And that's a way to without judgment be able to express how you might feel, which might not be as socially acceptable, saying that I am relieved that like a parent is no longer with me. And so it just helps to be a little more honest. And it doesn't trigger that natural, maybe more natural self-protective side of us where it's like, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't say this, especially as we're social creatures, crave social acceptance and belonging, especially in the teenage years. And so if you say something that typically isn't socially acceptable, you're at risk of being cut off. But if you write it down, you're not. And then another thing it does is just slow down the cognitive speed. Our mind thinks super fast. Our grief thoughts are much, much faster. So this just helps to physically slow us down. I mean, often our mind and our thoughts, they race faster than we can actually write down. So it forces us to slow down. It can help us to be more mindful and more present in what we're doing because it's an active process. Like you really have to be engaged in it. You really have to focus on it. And then it helps your thoughts to kind of land, basically to have them close, especially if we're outwardly processing things by talking. It can be easy to just talk and talk and talk in circles and never really land the plane. A lot of times with rumination, that's what's happening, or just about every time. And so writing actually helps us to land just by the natural nature of writing things. Like when we write, we have periods that we put at the end of our sentence. And so that even being a symbol of like closure and the fact that the books, the pages, they have to end, or you might turn a page. Like these are symbols that let us know, okay, I need to land this thought. Last two things that writing a letter really helps with is it helps to create a safe, contained ritual or a containment ritual. And why rituals help with grief is because the brain loves predictability and structure. I mean, if you remember from the last grief recap, I mentioned that was one of the things to do to help teens is give them a predictable routine, predictable schedule, structure. And so this kind of ritual does that. And it creates really a safe emotional container. I can put this on the page and just leave it there. I can close the book and leave my thoughts there if I need to, if it's too overwhelming, and I can come back to it at another point. Like literally thinking about it as a container. And this is great too because now that person, they're more in control. And the last thing that writing really does too is help to give a person that's grieving a sense of this agency, a sense of control. You're the one who's writing the words down on the paper. You're the one that's choosing how to write and what you want it to look like. And then you're the one that's choosing the ending. And this is very active. It's not passive. So it can help with that sense of empowerment and another way to help kind of get out of feeling stuck. So there's so many ways that it's helpful. And one of the really great parts about it too is that it's so accessible. I mean, most people can have access to a piece of paper and a pen. And even if you don't, like maybe you go in a restaurant and you steal some napkins and then, I don't know, you find a pen, you take it from somewhere, take it from like a hotel lobby. So it's incredibly accessible, more so than maybe other methods of grief, like even going to therapists, people like me, for instance, where, maybe you don't have the money to pay for the sessions or the time or the energy to do some of what that takes, or maybe there is that fear of opening up to another person. Like it's just so accessible. And especially for teens, it's simple enough that teens can do it too, and super accessible for them, and probably more preferred than going to like your counselor and talking about it, which we see that Max does. It seems like she's kind of forced to do, I guess, after Billy passes. And so really, I love that Stranger Things included this because writing a letter is such a great thing to do to help to process grief with a deceased loved one. If you did make it all the way here, oh my gosh, thank you so much for sticking with me through what is definitely going to be the longest video that I have. This was the most work I've done on a video, and honestly I ever want to do. There was a lot of great portions of doing this, but it was super time consuming. So if you watch this, thank you so much. Super appreciated it. Super, was that English? Sorry, I've been recording for so long. It's like 10:30 at night, so super tired, but I very much appreciated it, and I hope to see you in the next video.